investors and analysts, the subject of which is the full year 2022 financial results of TAURON Group and also for Q4 last year. The hosts of today's meetings are Mr. Paweł Szczeszek, the President of the Management Board, TAURON Polska Energia, and Mr. Krzysztof Surma, the Vice President of the Management Board responsible for finance, CFO. My name is Łukasz Zimnoch, and I will be conducting today's conference. The presentation, ladies and gentlemen, traditionally is being conducted in Polish along with the simultaneous interpreting into English. Apart from the broadcast, you can always listen in to today's meeting using the teleconference mode of operation. I'd like to invite you to ask questions right away using the form of a broadcast. The only option to ask question is to use this form, which is available on the broadcast website. I can see that you've already started sending questions. Mr. President, let me hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to the conference, the subject of which is to discuss the full year 2022 financial results of TAURON Group. I will be presenting my part, the key highlights, the financial situation of the group, important events that took place since our last meeting. On the other hand, Mr. President Krzysztof Surma will present the macroeconomic situation, the financial results posted, and the outlook for 2023. One of the main important events of 2020 was the adoption of a new strategy of TAURON Group, which assumes several-fold increase of installed capacity in renewable energy sources and reducing carbon emissions by 80%. In 2022, we acquired 2 wind farms, 1 photovoltaic farms. We commissioned 2 wind farms, 1 PV farm, and we acquired 5 projects of the total capacity about 200 megawatts. In 2022, we completed the process of the sale of the shares of TAURON Wydobycie, TAURON Mining, to the State Treasury. In parallel, as you know very well, there is a process underway to spin off the generation assets into the National Energy Security Agency. Let's move on to slide number 2. The first, number 1, the key data for full year 2022. On this slide, we are presenting the financial results and operating data obtained or generated by TAURON Group for the full year 2022. It was a very challenging year. We've had to face the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis and the commodity crisis that followed. Difficult situation on the energy and fuels market also had an impact upon the financial results of TAURON Group. The strong growth of energy prices, electricity prices, gas and coal prices were reflected in a much higher sales revenue year over year. On the other hand, we also reported a very strong increase of operating expenses, cost of operations. So as a result, the EBITDA result was flat versus 2021 and slightly above 4 billion PLN. At the net profit level, we posted a loss of 134 million. This loss was due, among others, the fact of booking the impairment charges and an increase of financial costs. The 2022 capital expenditures went up by 35%, approaching 4 billion PLN. This is the result of a green turn of TAURON and the acceleration of investments in the renewables. The volumes that the group generated with respect to electricity distribution and production distribution was close to 2021 results. We can see much lower renewable energy sources output, which is due to the less favorable weather conditions. Beginning of last year, we had faced a drought, which had a negative impact upon the volume of production at the hydroelectric power plants. On the other hand, the fourth quarter was characterized by the unfavorable wind conditions. The average temperatures in 2022 were lower than in 2021, which was reflected in the lower volume of the heat generated. On the next slide, we are presenting the data that covers only Q4 last year. Similar as in case of data for the full year, we can see an increase of sales revenue, increase of the operating expenses, and a negative net profit. The net debt to EBITDA ratio at the end of 2022 remained at a safe level of 2.9. With respect to the operating data, we experienced a very strong decline of the volume of electricity production from renewable energy sources, which was due to the unfavorable wind conditions that we faced in Q4 last year. Besides, we also observed the decline of electricity distribution and retail electricity supply volumes, which was the effect of a weakening of economic sentiment, economic downturn, and a growing number of prosumers. Thanks to the launching 2 new coal phases and good geological conditions, we increased by about 10% the production of commercial coal. Let's move on to the summary of the most important events, the highlights of 2022. On this slide, we are presenting the most important events that occurred in 2022. Since the majority of them already covered when I was doing the previous earnings calls, let me focus on the most important strategic events for TAURON Group. In view of the geopolitical and market changes that are the aftermath of Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine, the key issue is to ensure the safety, the security of the national power system. In this context, the green transition process is even more important, departure from the fossil fuels and increase of renewable energy sources. In response to these challenges, in June, we adopted the new strategy of TAURON Group for the years 2022-2030 with an outlook until 2050. Our goal is to accelerate the green turn of TAURON, and by year 2025 we will be having about 1.6 gigawatts in installed capacity in renewables. In 2030 it's going to be 3.7 gigawatts of installed capacity. We are planning to achieve climate neutrality in 2050. Ladies and gentlemen, 2022 was a major step towards accomplishing our strategy. We commissioned the Majewo and Piotrków wind farms. We also completed the second stage of constructing the Choszno PV farm. We started working on the Mysłowice PV farm. We acquired the SPVs in Brzezina, Nowa Warblewo and Gamów, and also the PV farm in Broszówek. At the stage of advanced analysis, we have several other projects, both wind farms and PV farms, with a total capacity of 800 megawatts. In comparison to the previous year, the capex in the renewable segment went up about 5 times. We are steadfastly implementing the process of departing from the coal assets. At the end of 2022, we divested to the State Treasury 100% of the shares in TAURON Wydobycie, TAURON Mining, which includes coal mines Sobieski, Janina and Brzeszcze. We are also completing the works aimed at spinning off into the National Energy Security Office, the hard coal generation assets. This is the most important strategic process conducted over the last years. We should be able to complete this process in the second quarter of this year. Let me hand over the floor to President Krzysztof Surma, the CFO, who will continue the presentation, will present to you the financial part. Please. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to the macroeconomic and market situation. Last year we were dealing with the gradual slowdown of the economic growth rate, GDP growth rate, which had an impact upon the decline of electricity consumption, especially in the second half of the year, but mostly in the last quarter of last year. At the same time, Poland still produced more electricity year over year, which was due mainly to the situation of the neighboring countries. In the neighboring countries, the electricity price was higher than in Poland. Therefore, Poland was a net exporter of electricity. Therefore, the production of electricity year over year was higher. With respect to the distribution of those production, first of all, the renewables were the main beneficiary of this growth, among others due to the large increase of the PV installations, including the prosumer-based installations. in terms of gas-fired installations, we faced a major decline, which is obvious because worldwide the gas prices went skyrocketed. Therefore, there was a major reduction of production based on gas. In terms of production based on coal, one may say it was almost flat year over year. However, there was a certain allocation, so there was a decline of electricity production from the hard coal-fired power plants. Here we're dealing with a major increase of the price of hard coal during the year. Also, there was a limited supply on the hard coal in the market, and some of the generation was shifted to the lignite-fired units. If we move on now to the situation directly of TAURON Group, we were dealing with a major increase of revenue year over year, more than 40, almost 46%. However, let us remember that this growth was caused by a major increase of the price of electricity, gas, and coal on the market. At the same time, we had the same impact. It had the same impact on the cost side for the group, on the OPEX. Net profit, a major impact came from the impairment charge relative to the coal assets that was mentioned, that were divested to the state treasury and had an impact on the loss, led to the net loss for the full year 2022. If we look at the EBITDA, comparable EBITDA year over year, well, also we were dealing with a decline. Here we faced difficult, challenging market conditions that the CEO mentioned. Also, the group was affected by them, and the comparable EBITDA year over year dropped by 16%. Here this adjusted EBITDA was impacted by the one-off events that took place both in 2021 as well as 2022. We are talking about one-off transactions on the CO2 emission allowances, carbon credits, and we were also dealing in both years with provisions for onerous contracts. If those one-off events, if we stripped them out from the reported EBITDA, then we would arrive at the adjusted EBITDA, and as I mentioned, year over year it was about 16% lower. If we now move on to the data for Q4 alone, this data is pretty similar to the full year data. The quarter growth on the revenue side is a bit lower, but still high, about 36% of the revenue growth rate. The reasons are exactly the same. Here in Q4, you can see the cause of the net loss. This is this impairment charge related to the coal assets that took place last year, was actually implemented in Q4 in terms of the comparable EBITDA alone, quarter over quarter, so Q4 22 versus Q4 2021. Here the main one-off events, these are the provisions for onerous contracts, and after if you strip them out, the EBITDA year over year is lower also in Q4. If we now move on generally for the full results of a segment, traditionally our key segment is the distribution segment, stable result year over year, and for many years more than 70% of our EBITDA is generated in this line of business. Here good earnings also were posted by the renewables segment. However, very weak earnings were posted by the generation segment, but I will expand on that later, elaborate on that when I discuss the segment. Also worth to note, to emphasize good earnings of the mining segment, historic high. I will elaborate on that when I discuss individual segments situation. If we move on now to the Q4 alone results, earnings, here we can say that a bit weaker earnings posted by the distribution than typically, but please note the fact that, and when I mentioned the general situation in the country, so the decline of electricity consumption mainly took place in Q4, and this has immediate impact upon the distribution segment. At the same time, Q4 is the best quarter in the history of a mining subsidiary as part of TAURON Group. If we move on now to the segments and comparing the reported EBITDA year over year here, this reported EBITDA, as you can see on the slide, comes out worst in the generation segment. However, it's worth remembering that in 2021, we continued to be dealing with a cost-plus contract between TAURON Polska Energia and Nowe Jaworzno. That's probably the last time I'm mentioning this topic during the earnings call, but to understand correctly the comparable results, I have to remind this fact once again. About 1,250,000,000 PLN. That was the shift between the supply and the generation segments. Of course, the generation segment also was negatively impacted by the hard coal prices. Here also we have a certain transfer shift between the two segments, between the mining and the generation segment. I will elaborate on that when I discuss the individual segments. Q4. Here also we are dealing with a similar situation, so the mining and the supply segments show a major increase of the contribution to the reported EBITDA, while the generation segment here, also the distribution segment, bring about a decline of EBITDA year over year, talking about the comparable 21 versus 22. Here, as I mentioned, talking about the distribution, it's a matter of volumes. In Q4, let us remember, in 2021, we still had an accelerating economy and a growing volume of electricity consumption. Q4 2022, we experienced a decline of consumption. That's why we have such varying results, earnings in the distribution segment. Whereas in the generation segment, let us remember that the part of the results in the context of reported EBITDA is already addressed in the provision for the onerous contracts in the earlier quarters. If we move on now to the distribution segment, our flagship segment, our key segment, as I mentioned before, let me start with negative factors. So this decline of the volume, this is the effect that was visible in Q4. The second negative factor that had an impact upon that was a growing cost, both labor costs as well as growing taxes on real estate. In addition, we are seeing as a negative factor here the issue of balancing difference costs. However, let us not forget that this cost, or the cost of grid losses, is impacted by several factors. The one that had a negative impact in 2022 is the issue of higher price, increase of price that we had to pay for electricity to cover the grid losses, whereas the grid losses themselves, in terms of their volume, were lower, in fact, than in 2021, and the upward adjustment also balance was positive. Therefore, this bar should be combined with the first one, and this is the key positive impact upon the distribution segment, namely the increase of the tariff, increase of rate for the distributed electricity. If we combine both factors, both bars, so the increase of grid rate and the increase of the cost of purchasing electricity to cover the grid losses, those two bars combined, the outcome is positive. Therefore, we have a stable, flat earnings of distribution year over year, despite the fact that in 2021 we faced major positive volumes, and a large portion of the result was also on the regulated account, which will be settled over the coming years. If we look at Q4 alone, here we can see that this volume that basically during the year was lost, or which the declined one year over year, occurred mainly in Q4. Therefore, a still greater impact of visibility of that loss, greater magnitude of the loss on the volume. However, at the same time, in terms of cost of grid losses, here the volume of grid losses was comparable year over year, and thus in you can fully see the effect of increase of prices year over year in terms of the cost of purchasing this service or this electricity to cover the balancing differences or grid losses. If we move on now to the metrics, key metrics is good piece of information. All the quality metrics were met. Of course, we're talking about the quality metrics set by the President of Energy Regulatory Office. So there will be no negative impact on the tariff for not meeting the quality parameters. If we now move on to the renewables segment, here the main factor determining the earnings is, of course, the price on the market and the volume. In terms of volume, as the CEO has already mentioned, those volumes were lower year over year. Here, first of all, we're dealing with a much lower generation from hydropower plants. We're dealing with so-called hydrological drought, and therefore the volume of electricity generated by the hydropower plants was lower year over year. At the same time, on the market, we were dealing with an increasing price, and all the transactions that were covered by the hedging before could have been also sold at on the spot market at higher prices. Therefore, we got a major increase of EBITDA year over year, which was basically driven by the increase of prices on the market. If we move on now to Q4 alone, in the renewables, here situation is similar. However, similar as for the full year, volume is lower year over year. However, we have a major decline in the wind energy generation. The generation of electricity by hydropower plants was almost flat, whereas we had dealing with a much worse weather conditions regarding winds, so we generated much less volume of electricity, so this is reflected in the earnings. The price effect itself was not sufficient to make this EBITDA recurring year over year. What's even more, we were dealing with a decline in the prices of the rights to the so-called green certificates. Those prices were lower quarter over quarter, and therefore this also had an impact upon the lower earnings of the renewables segment in this respect. If we now move on to the generation segment, here this segment brought the weakest results out of all the segments in our group, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, to offset or to make it comparable, to compare 2021 versus 2022, one would have to transfer about 1 billion 200 billion from the generation segment to the supply segment. But still, that loss, if it were to turn out, even if we brought about this comparability, we would still be dealing with almost 1 billion worse earnings year over year. And this was mainly impacted by two factors. The first factor is the shutdown of the unit, both in the first part of the year from January to April. I'm talking about the 910 megawatt unit in Jaworzno, as well as in August. Let's remember that in August, the price of electricity were highest on the market in Poland last year, and during that time, TAURON had to buy back electricity that was contracted for this unit. So this is the first key factor of significant loss. The other component, the other factor is the growing hard coal prices, which also led to the situation where the profitability of the contracts that had been signed in the previous years was negative to a large degree. If we move on to Q4 alone results, here again we are dealing with this effect of a cost plus contract. Just to make it comparable, one would have to strip out about 550 million out of this opening bars of the 2021 year. And here again, we are dealing in Q4 with the higher coal prices effect. Here, the increase of the coal prices affected this quarter most, and this quarter, as a matter of fact, of the earnings in this quarter were had the biggest impact, negative impact, because of due to the rising hard coal prices. So the rising coal price had the biggest impact upon this quarter. If we move on now to the supply segment, here the situation is reversed. As a matter of fact, the 1,250 million that I mentioned before should be transferred into the earnings for 2021, and therefore, if we adjusted these earnings, that we would get very comparable, almost flat earnings year over year. Of course, they're a bit lower because of not the gas tariff and the G tariff not fully covering the costs, and the difference that we are referring to year over year would probably come in at about 100+ million. However, we need to emphasize at the same time that we had some allocation, the supply segment, between the entities that are part of a segment. This allocation was between the supply companies operating on the domestic market and the Czech company, Czech subsidiary. Historically, good results, good earnings. The Czech subsidiary was taking advantage of the difference in prices between Poland and Czech Republic and generated the best earnings in its history. If we move on now to Q4 alone in this segment, supply segment, here the situation looked also was very similar. As I mentioned, if we stripped out those 550 million from the generation segment to the supply segment, which was due to the contract concluded between Nowe Jaworzno and TAURON under the cost plus formula, then the earnings for the segment would be almost flat year over year. The effect of gas tariff not fully covering the cost was not that relevant, not had so much impact as in case of the full year results. Here we are dealing with a clear decline of the volume of electricity sold, the same as in case of distribution. This also in case of supply segment. This Q4 looks worse in terms of electricity sold to the customers. It is also different versus the distribution due to the growing increase of the prosumer installations than the electricity that is accounted for as part of the production by the prosumers installations. Now let us move on to the segment that we are showing probably for the last time from the TAURON Group's perspective. Here, as the CEO mentioned at the beginning, the coal mines were divested, were sold to the state treasury, so will not be showing the mining segment in our subsequent earnings calls. At the very end of its operation as part of TAURON, the segment posted very good earnings. This result is to a large degree a reflection of very high hard coal prices. Hard coal prices year over year went up by more than 100%, both on the market of a coal sold to individual consumers, to the heating plants, as well as to the district heating plants. So we are dealing with major increases in all parts of the market, and it had an impact upon very good earnings of the mining segment, and the largest sale of a large lump coal and medium-sized coal. It also carries a larger margin, so it generated better earnings for the segment. At the same time, the negative impact came from the increase of the labor costs, increase of the electricity energy costs, and the increase of the cost of materials, and those factors will also have an impact upon the earnings of that segment in the subsequent years, whereas the coal price in the subsequent quarters will be declining, but this will not have a direct impact upon the earnings of TAURON Group. If we're talking about the Q4 earnings for the mining segment, you can see even a stronger price effect. In Q4, we are dealing with a cumulative impact of the increase of coal price, and this effect and the impact upon the EBITDA was highest. At the same time, it was combined with a very good production effect. At the time, practically all the coal faces, all the long walls that are available at the coal mines of TAURON Mining. So the volume effect combined with the very high price generated the highest earnings in the history of this subsidiary. If we move on now to the debt year over year went up. However, let us remember that during that period, that time frame, TAURON repaid or redeemed or bought out the shares from PFR and paid the liability. That liability was paid in 2022, that originated from the previous periods. Other important things is the fact that the leverage ratio, net debt to EBITDA ratio, is 2.9, which is high, but at the same time still at a safe level. What is important, it's worth to note that in 2022, TAURON signed a large new program that refinanced the previous debt. It was a 4 billion PLN worth program signed in July last year. It allowed us to push forward the maturities. So in 2023, in the current year, we don't have a major maturity of a major debt coming in. So here it's worth to indicate the hedging of a portfolio. If we combine the fixed rate, including the IRS, so the hedging instruments, the instruments that convert effectively floating rate into the fixed rate. So about 2/3 of the portfolio, credit portfolio of TAURON is hedged. So about 1/3 of the portfolio, that portfolio of TAURON is exposed to the floating rate risk. If we talk about the capital expenditures, here we were dealing with a major increase year over year. Our capex came in at about 4 billion PLN. The majority of capex, as every year was spent in the distribution line of business. We also experienced a slight increase year over year. The main issue is installing new connections, new customers' connections to the grid, and implementing new power lines. We had a 5-fold increase of the capex in the renewables. It's a major qualitative increase in line with our strategy. At the same time, we were also dealing with an increase of capex in the more conventional generation segment and in the coal mines. However, here let us remember that the majority of that spending is also related to the heat line of business, especially in the generation part, and this segment will stay with us, and it's related to the gradual decarbonization in this area. If we now move on to the outlook that we face, that we have ahead of us, let me start with our key segment, namely the distribution segment. We are expecting our earnings to go up in the distribution in 2023. This is due to the increase of the tariff set by the President of the Energy Regulatory Office. Here the WACC, weighted average cost of capital, based on which the rate of return in the distribution segment is calculated, will go up from about 5.8 to around 8.5%. This will lead to a major increase in this segment earnings. And also it's worth to note certain risks and certain things that we are already aware of. In terms of risk, it's a matter of volume. Here, depending upon what is the level of electricity consumption in Poland, this will to a certain degree determine the earnings generated by the distribution. The second factor that we are aware of is the settlement of a regulated account. As I mentioned, in 2021, the regulated account was positively fed, so we had funds deposited there due to the volume that was higher that we had covered by the tariff. So those funds will have to be settled this year and will have an impact upon the EBITDA in the distribution line of business. Nevertheless, we still expect the EBITDA to go up in this line of business. Regarding the renewables segment, I mentioned when I described the earnings, it's volume and price, two determinant factors. Volume, we expect an increase of volume of electricity generated in this line of business year over year. In terms of the price, here it will be impacted by the new regulations, and the regulations related to the limits or transferring funds to certain funds to the fund, this will have a negative impact upon the earnings in the renewables line of business. Therefore, the earnings year over year we expect to be lower. In terms of the generation segment, following the weak results last year, it's not a big surprise for us to expect an increase, but we expect EBITDA to be positive. It's not going to be just grow, but it'll actually translate into a positive EBITDA in this line of business. Among the positive factors, we expect a stable operation of the Nowe Jaworzno units, and at the same time, we assume that the total of the contracts combined will signed in the previous years, in the current year, will generate a positive effect in terms of a margin of a first degree. So overall, we expect a positive EBITDA in this line of business. Of course, the segment will still be impacted by the higher coal prices from last year and the growing fixed costs. In terms of a supply segment, here we expect stable earnings year over year. Of course, here this segment is to a certain degree, its earnings to a certain degree are regulated by the charges to the funds, and a certain risk that comes up, it's a matter of volumes of electricity supply, very strongly tied to the overall economic situation in Poland. In terms of capex, we expect the capex to go up. However, basically, this capex will be highly correlated to the financial capabilities of our group, and was worth emphasizing the key spending will happen in the distribution segment. There's no surprise, it happens every year. The second key spending area would be the renewables, and these two segments basically, in these two segments, the key capex will be focused. In terms of debt, the key is to maintain the safe level, to be in line with all the bank covenants, and our goal would be to maintain the investment grade rating. That's all regarding the outlook for the coming year. Thank you very much for the first part of the presentation, and let's have a Q&A session. Yes, thank you very much for the presentation to the President of the Management Board. We've had some questions. Some of the questions are very multi-threaded questions. I'll not be reading all of them coming from a single offer. I will try to split them into a few ones to make easier answers. The first question came from Mr. Chojnacki from WNP. How much was in December 2022 the charges to the WRC fund, and how much would be those charges in Q1 2023? The price difference fund. In terms of the charge in December 2022, it's clocked in at 18 million. In terms of the charge in the first quarter 2023, we'll be publishing this information as we are presenting the earnings for Q1. Next question from Mr. Chojnacki. Until the end of 2023, 15% of TAURON's customer distribution should be equipped with the remote readout meters. How is the process moving? Will this milestone be achieved? Well, the installation of meters is progressing gradually, but let's remember that the majority of the meters on the territory covered by the TAURON distribution was installed in Wrocław. That's a large portion of customers. So as of now, we are not assuming any deviation in this respect. As of the end of, that's the last question from Mr. Chojnacki, as of the end of 2022, TAURON Group had renewables of a total capacity of 659 megawatts. How much capacity in renewables will be added in 2023, and what technologies? Well, as we announced in our strategy, after less than a year of implementing the green turn of strategy, this increases to 1.6 gigawatts and 3.7 by 2030 in 2025 are not in jeopardy. It's difficult to expect that this will be linear growth year by year. However, as of now, our approach is very optimistic. We view it very optimistically, and the progress of our works and projects does not indicate that we will not be in line with our plans, and even on the other way around, we will achieve it earlier than we had planned originally. A few questions from Mr. Bartłomiej Sawicki from the Rzeczpospolita Daily and the Parkiet newspaper. First question regarding the talks with Rafako. What is the reason for the extension of the talks with Rafako? We are conducting TAURON generation segment is conducting talks with Rafako as part of a mediation with the aid of legal counsels of the Republic of Poland. As you know, recently we published the assumptions for the settlement agreement. Today we are working on how to formulate the content of this agreement. I think we are on the right track to come to this agreement. Next few questions are regarding Łagisza. The biomass-fired unit in Łagisza is posting losses. What are the reasons? When can you expect the tender for the gas-fired unit in Łagisza to take place? Regarding the earnings of the biomass-fired unit in Łagisza, the cause of that is the reason for that is the cost of biomass and difficulties on the commodity markets, raw materials market last year. The planned tripling of the renewables capacity over 7 years will be possible to shoulder by TAURON distribution. How large capex should be there? Let me come back to our strategy that we announced in June last year, which assumes an increase of capex on the distribution up to 24 billion by the end of 2030. This is about 50% increase, but let me note that our activities regarding acquisitions or construction of a new capacity, new installed capacity is taking place not only on the territory covered by TAURON distribution area. Just to add, because it's also worth adding that the increase of capacity, because the question, are you talking about the tripling the capacity over 7 years in the national power system or in Poland or in TAURON Group? And here it's clear that regarding TAURON Group alone, its distribution is not responsible for expanding capacity in terms of the national power system. We are showing a clear increase of capex year over year in distribution, preparing for being able to connect new sources. This is a joint in the renewables, so it's a joint strategy, common strategy with the President of Energy Regulatory Office. I have a question: how much were the charges to the price difference fund last year? The answer was given to the answer: 18 million. What are the forecasts regarding the capex in 2023, especially regarding renewables investments? How much and in what is TAURON planning to invest this year? Well, forecast for this year are about 4.6 billion PLN. Regarding renewables, this is almost 1 billion PLN. In terms of renewables alone, of course, the key, as I mentioned before during the presentation, the key is the distribution line of business, and the majority of capex will be spent in this segment. In terms of renewables, basically this is going to be the similar investment direction as up to now, so wind farms and PV farms onshore. Of course, some maybe beginnings of spending in offshore, but let's remember that we are at the stage of a licensing process now and not at the implementation stage yet. Can we expect a lower EBITDA year over year in 2023, taking into account the fact that in the current year as much as 20% comes from the discontinued operations? segment. Well, let us remember, for 2022, a number of factors had an impact, starting with the most unexpected one being the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, and the major volatility on the commodity markets and electricity markets. At the same time, the impact on the individual segments of the operations, which we could clearly see, especially in the generation segment and the mining segment. We are expecting, as we indicated when we talked about the outlook, we expect growth both in the generation as well as the distribution line of business, a stable earnings in flat earnings in the supply and a bit lower earnings in the renewables segment. However, we expect that EBITDA year over year will be at least flat. So, answering this question, we are not expecting that due to divesting one segment that our EBITDA year over year will be lower. Now, a few questions related to the National Energy Security Agency, how this issue of transferring the assets to the agency, NABE agency, and the liability related to that. In other words, what level of assets will be transferred to NABE, split into fixed assets and current assets, and how much assets will be shifted in terms of a distribution or division into the interest-bearing and non-interest-bearing assets. Well, of course, regarding the work on the NABE agency, the process is still underway. As of now, no one has assumed so far any detailed spinning off of assets, so splitting the companies into fixed and current assets and the spin-off process. As a matter of fact, the entire TAURON generation subsidiary will be spun off and the capital group around it in 2022. Let me remind you that first we shifted, let's say, the shares from two subsidiaries, TAURON Service, TAURON Bioeco, from the TAURON Polska Energia level to TAURON Generation, and TAURON Generation became an almost 100% owner of those subsidiaries. At the same time, we merged the New Jaworzno of TAURON Wytwarzanie with TAURON Generation, so we have a single subsidiary TAURON Generation now. So we're not talking about splitting assets, we are talking about the transfer of the entire subsidiary. In terms of the debt, the valuation is the key, and then based on the valuation, we could discuss the split of the debt. Let us remember that at TAURON we don't have any external debt that is strictly tied to the coal part. We don't have it like that. And it's our intragroup debt, depending upon the final agreements reached and the agreed upon valuation, will be adequately, accordingly allocated and repaid either through the direct transaction or later by NABE themselves to a certain degree. The time has come for the last questions, ladies and gentlemen. Are the red-breaking earnings due to the windfall profits? Should it be taxed? What is the advice? So, as advised by the European Union and the International Energy Agency. This is a question from Mr. Stachura from Business Alert. Well, in terms of the TAURON Group's earnings, it's difficult to speak about the record-breaking earnings since we have worse earnings year over year, not only reported, not to mention the adjusted earnings, by about 16% year over year. And additionally, you must remember that there were charges to the fund that were introduced that also affect the utility, the energy group. So we are talking about the windfall tax or windfall profits issues. Here we are talking probably about other groups other than energy groups, than utilities, electric utilities. I think this question is no longer applicable directly to TAURON. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for the presentation. Thank you for answering the questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now invite you to our next meeting right after we publish the Q1 2023 earnings. We will give you We'll forward to you information in a traditional way about the date of the conference. Thank you very much for the meeting. Have a nice day.